The MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is brought to you locally by Northern States Power Company, putting creative energy to work for you. For Danny's office furniture stores, where the look of success costs less, much less. Federated Insurance Companies, the recommended business insurance company for members of over 150 regional and national business trade associations and groups. Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi, celebrating 50 years of providing legal services to individuals and businesses in Minnesota and throughout the nation. The CIT New Beginning Mutual Fund Group, managed by CIT Investment Associates, the $2.5 billion Minneapolis-based professional investment organization. And by Northgate Computer Systems, a Minnesota-based manufacturer of high-performance IBM-compatible micros with 2 Twin City factory outlets.
Good evening. Leading the news this Monday, President Bush approved a federal plan to attack drug crime in Washington, D.C. Oliver North said President Reagan concealed an arms shipment to Iran. There were more nationalist demonstrations in Soviet Georgia. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Judy Woodruff is in Washington tonight. Judy?
After the news summary, we focus first tonight on the Oliver North trial. Nina Totenberg brings us up to date. Then the Bush administration's attack on drugs in the nation's capital. D.C. congressional delegate Walter Fauntleroy, Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates, and crime expert Bruce Jackson will be here with their assessments. Finally, yesterday's massive abortion march in Washington. Is the Supreme Court listening, and what is it likely to do? Constitutional scholars Dick Howard, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and Gary McDowell join us.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change, and this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The Bush administration today announced a concerted federal effort to crack down on drug-related crime in Washington, D.C. It'll spend $70 to $80 million on more prison space and more drug agents. The plan was approved today by President Bush and announced by National Drug Policy Director William Bennett. He said with 135 murders so far this year, the problem in Washington is getting worse, not better.
Our initiative offers this city some time, some help, some breathing room so that it can meet its fundamental responsibility for law, order, and for public health and safety in Washington streets and neighborhoods. We are willing to do a lot for now, but make no mistake, we are insisting on resolute and substantive efforts from the district in the long run. And the plain fact is that for too long and in too many respects, the D.C. government has failed to serve its citizens.
We'll have more on the new plan later in the program. Mexican authorities said they had arrested the reputed mastermind of a drug ring that shipped 2 tons of cocaine a month into the United States. Felix Gallardo was arrested in Guadalajara, and in his hometown in Sinaloa State, the entire local police force was arrested. Judy?
Former White House aide Oliver North was challenged today about his handling of thousands of dollars in funds raised by the sale of arms to Iran and intended for use by the Nicaraguan Contras. Facing cross-examination by a prosecuting attorney, North struggled to keep his temper while insisting that he had not taken some of the money for his personal use. Under questioning by his own lawyer, North testified that former President Reagan and former Attorney General Edwin Meese concealed U.S. involvement in a 1985 shipment of Hawk missiles from Israel to Iran.
President Bush today signed legislation to protect government employees who blow the whistle on fraud and mismanagement. Last year, President Reagan vetoed a similar bill on the ground that certain sections were unconstitutional. Congress passed a new version which President Bush today declared free of constitutional flaws. He also told a White House audience that whistleblowers deserve protection.
A true whistleblower is a public servant of the highest order. And I share the determination of the Congress that we do everything possible to ensure that these dedicated men and women should not be fired or rebuked or suffer financially for their honesty and good judgment. This bill will go a long way toward this goal by strengthening the protections and procedural rights available to those federal employees who report misdeeds and mismanagement.
Hundreds of abortion rights activists followed up yesterday's massive rally in Washington by lobbying their members of Congress today. Those who visited Capitol Hill stopped by members' offices to thank them for their support. Leaders of the march, meanwhile, predicted that the 300,000 or more men, women, and children who showed up yesterday will leave a strong impression on the Supreme Court, which is due to take up an abortion rights case later this month. Vice President Dan Quayle, however, said the march was nothing unusual and added he didn't believe the Supreme Court would be swayed by a demonstration.
High winds and seas were beginning to break up the huge Alaska oil spill today. The slick stalled in its progress across Prince William Sound, but the same weather conditions hampered cleanup efforts along the coast. The slick has been heading towards Kodiak, the nation's largest fishing port, and preparations to protect the fisheries went on today. With the oil still 60 miles away, local fishermen were still putting up booms.
A Soviet newspaper reported today that the nuclear submarine that caught fire and sank last Friday has been located at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea, more than 300 miles north of Norway. The paper also said officials believe electrical problems may have caused the fire and the explosions that sank the Mike-class submarine, which the Soviets acknowledged was carrying 2 torpedoes with nuclear warheads. It also reported that of the 42 sailors who had been killed, the bodies of 19 had been recovered. The 27 survivors, shown here on a life raft on Friday, were said to be hospitalized in serious condition.
In Soviet Georgia, troops fired warning shots today to disperse a rally of Georgians demanding more autonomy from Moscow. Schools, factories, and stores were closed by a general strike. Soviet tanks and troops lined the center of Tbilisi, the capital, after a week of ethnic unrest that has taken at least 18 lives. The Kremlin sent Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze, himself a Georgian, to calm the situation. Yesterday, mass demonstrations in Tbilisi led to a clash with troops in which 16 people were killed and 2 died later. Human rights activists claimed the death toll was 50, but this could not be confirmed. Soviet human rights activist Andrei Sakharov has been named a candidate for the new Soviet Congress. The Nobel Prize-winning scientist was originally rejected by an electoral commission, but restored by supporters at the Academy of Sciences.
That's it for our summary of the day's news. Just ahead on the NewsHour, Oliver North cross-examined. The Bush administration targets drugs in D.C., and yesterday's abortion march and the Supreme Court. First tonight, the Oliver North trial. North himself took the witness stand for the 3rd day today. Charlene Hunter-Gault and Nina Totenberg have more. Charlene?
Judy, the prosecution began its cross-examination of North late this morning. Earlier in the day, under direct questioning from his own lawyers, North said that former President Reagan and then Attorney General Edwin Meese had concealed U.S. involvement in a 1985 arms shipment to Iran. Here to tell us more about North's day in court is Nina Totenberg, legal affairs correspondent for National Public Radio. Nina, the defense did finish its cross-examination of North today. What did we hear from him?
Well, the main thing, as you said, Charlene, is this allegation that the President and the Attorney General were still keeping the 85 Hawk missile shipment a secret from the American public, and that that's the reason that North was acting in a similar manner. But of course, the way it was presented by the defense, I suspect, will be somewhat countered eventually by the prosecution. The defense, for example, pointed to President Reagan's now rather famous, I think it was November 19th, press conference in which he said there was no third country involved in any of the Iran arms business. And of course, the White House clarified that within 15 minutes of the press conference and said that the President had made an error. That did not come out today. I am sure the prosecutor will make it come out rather quickly. But then we moved on to cross-examination, and that was really the big feast of the day.
All right, tell us a little bit about that. How did it begin?
Well, Prosecutor John Kecker walked up to the lectern. I have never seen a grown man look more like a cat ready to spring than this guy did. I mean, his tongue was twisted around. He was really ready. He's been waiting for over 2 days to get his hands on Oliver North, and he could hardly contain himself. He spent almost all of the day trying to portray North as a man with rather common base money motives, a guy who was lining his pockets with these various deals, whether it be through gratuities from Richard Secord, the arms dealer that he was farming out a lot of this business to, or giving himself little gratuities from the White House $300,000 fund, or a number of other things, a trust fund set up for his children by the Swiss banker Willard Zucker, which was using the Iran-Contra money. That was the image that the prosecutors sought to portray. It was obviously not one that North was willing to accede to, but it was the image that Prosecutor John Kecker was trying for.
There's something about the car, or something about $15,000 that he saved in a closet or something?
This was really just fascinating. I mean, there's a great deal that goes on in this trial that is not new information, but we actually got some new information today. One of the examples that Prosecutor Kecker used to try to make this image work for him about North, the self-aggrandizer in a money sense, was the purchase of a car. And he said, yeah, you bought this car in October of 1985. You paid for it in cash. How much was it? North said $8,000. Where did you get $8,000 in cash? And North said, well, I keep a large cash fund in a steel box. We call it the family fund at home. And Prosecutor Kecker said, you keep that kind of money at home? Where did it come from? And North said, well, it's become a ritual that every Friday I come home and I empty the change from my pockets into this tin box. And Prosecutor Kecker said, and that made a fund of $15,000? Well, eventually North said that the fund started out as the lump sum payment from a car wreck. He never said how much that original lump sum was, and that it grew. But getting back to the car now, he said, all right, I went in and I paid $5,000 down. Prosecutor Kecker said, how far away is Richard Secord's office? And he said, a mile. And he said, and where did you go that day? Did you get the rest of the payment from Secord? Did you get the remaining $3,000 from Secord? And Oliver North said, I don't remember. I didn't use it for that. Many days I got lots of money from Secord, but I can't possibly tell you whether I got $3,000 on that day. And he said he couldn't recall, even when faced with what appeared to be some sort of financial record from Secord's office. And that was the way it went. I mean, we began to see the possibility, at least, of Oliver North being a guy who was trading money back and forth with Richard Secord.
And the trust fund for the children, that came up?
That came up too. Did you know that your wife went to Philadelphia to meet with Willard Zucker, who was the Swiss banker, and that they discussed the trust fund? North insisted he didn't know anything about the trust fund. He simply knew that she'd gone for a meeting, that they'd asked the ages of the children. But the money was set aside, and there was a memo written by Richard Secord saying $200,000 had been set aside in the Swiss accounts. North said he thought that was for the families of pilots who would be shot down helping the Contras, but he said he didn't know if the money ever actually went to them.
Now, there were also 16 or so notebooks that belonged to North. Is that right? I mean, were those came up today?
They came up in again, a way Prosecutor Kecker used this to his advantage. He said, well, where are all the financial records? You know, you say you didn't line your pockets. Where are all the financial records of this $300,000 White House fund where you were dispensing money right and left? And he said they were destroyed. Prosecutor Kecker, that sounds like an earthquake. Who destroyed them? He said, well, Oliver North said, I destroyed them on orders from CIA Director Casey. And Prosecutor Kecker said, why? He said, well, to protect all the names of people who were mentioned in those records, at which point Kecker said, but you kept 16 notebooks that had all the same names. You destroyed your financial records, but you kept these 16 notebooks. And he reached down physically and picked up this huge box filled with big, thick, I mean, these are not tiny little spiral notebooks. These are big deals. And he piled them up in front of North where they sat for the remainder of the day in front of the defendant as a kind of rude reminder.
How was North responding to all of this?
Well, he wasn't quite the respectful nice guy witness that he's been, the victim. He was a little bit more of the Oliver North we saw at the hearings, a little testy. He worked very hard to control his temper. He was a bit of a nitpicker. But that is really what you're supposed to be if you're defending yourself against these kinds of charges. There was a lot of, I don't recall, at points where it may strain credulity. And I've never seen Oliver North testify in a manner that I thought was maybe, I don't know quite what the expression is. He always looks like he believes it. Today there were a couple of moments where he was not remembering things that seemed to me that I wasn't sure if he really didn't remember it or not.
You said last week, at the end of the week, that you expected a lengthy cross-examination. Yeah. You still have that sense?
Absolutely. It'll be at least another day or two, I would think, minimum. He was cross-examined about the security fence today. It was the only moment where he really admitted error, saying it was the dumbest thing he'd ever done in his life. Mm-hmm. But there's lots and lots more ground to cover. We've only gone through, I would guess, about 25% of the material that's already been covered.
All right, Nina, thanks a lot, and we'll see you soon.
Still ahead on the NewsHour, the war on drugs in the nation's capital and whether the Supreme Court pays attention to events like yesterday's abortion rally.
Next tonight, federal intervention in the drug war in the nation's capital. As we reported, Federal Drug Policy Director William Bennett today announced a multi-million-dollar plan to help Washington, D.C. fight drug-related crime. Administration officials consider this initiative as a test case in the national battle against drugs and crime. The plan involves several different federal agencies and represents the first full-scale assault coordinated by the nation's drug czar. We'll discuss today's announcement after this background report by Kwame Holman.
For nearly 18 months, the drug-related death toll in and around Washington has risen steadily. In the city alone, 135 people were murdered since the start of the year. Local officials say 80% of the killings arose from disputes in the city's drug trade. The violence has drawn increasing attention from members of Congress who make Washington their home. At a recent hearing, U.S. senators voiced their impatience with the city's efforts to stem the drug murders.
We can't have people killed and blood running in the streets of the city like it was some third world capital run by a despot.
Similarly, the Bush administration has focused on the city's drug problem. Last month, Drug Policy Director William Bennett considered a plan to take federal control of the city police department. Today, Bennett announced instead a multi-agency federal task force to buttress the city's efforts against drug-related violence.
Here, where the problem is so glaring, so out of control, serious questions of local politics and governance can no longer be avoided or excused. They must be answered. We've determined that, consistent with the federal government's special relationship to the district, the need and the means exist for significant federal emergency assistance to the people of this city and this region. Today, we are announcing a plan for such assistance.
Among Bennett's proposals is immediate relief for the city's vastly overcrowded prison system. In the last 18 months, D.C. police arrested 30,000 people on drug charges, the highest per capita arrest rate in the nation. The Bennett plan on prisons calls for transfer of 250 inmates currently in the Washington jail to federal prisons. The resulting new jail space would be used to house new drug suspects arrested in the city. The plan also commits the Federal Bureau of Prisons to build a new 500-bed prison for the city and a 700-bed federal facility to house prisoners from the Washington-Baltimore region. Housing Secretary Jack Kemp's department is one of the 7 federal agencies cooperating in the Bush-Bennett anti-drug plan.
I'm asking today, D.C. Police Chief and the Public Housing Authority of D.C., along with public housing authorities around the country, to engage in those type of operations that can clear out and secure public housing projects from drug users and abusers and dealers.
The Housing Secretary's part of the anti-drug plan includes elimination of administrative rules to allow speedier evictions of public housing residents suspected of illegal drug activity, posting guards and erecting fences around public housing projects, requiring photo ID cards for entrance into public housing areas. Some of Kemp's initiatives already are in place in public housing developments. In Chicago, access to public housing already requires an ID card. Chicago officials say crime in those neighborhoods has fallen 30%. And the suburban Washington city of Alexandria recently received Kemp's permission to eliminate administrative eviction procedures. Housing officials in Alexandria and throughout Virginia now may evict public housing tenants first and defend the eviction in court later. The city of Alexandria's request to speed up the public housing eviction process grew out of this incident last month. A suspected drug dealer shot one Alexandria police officer to death and wounded another in this public housing development. Reportedly, he was trying to collect money from a young cocaine dealer who lived there. The last major component of the federal plan to help Washington, D.C. involves commitment of new federal law enforcement personnel.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation will temporarily add 25 agents to its investigative resources of major drug distribution networks and drug-related violent crime in the Washington metropolitan area to provide enhanced technical and forensic advice.
That technical advice includes access to the FBI's sophisticated evidence examination laboratory, help from 57 new investigators, including lawyers and military intelligence experts from the Department of Defense, a review of whether to employ the National Guard in Washington's war on drugs, and identification of drug cases for possible prosecution under the new federal death penalty law. But at today's news conference, drug czar William Bennett warned that ending drug-related crime and violence will take more than enhanced law enforcement.
I do not pretend that quick and easy solutions exist for Washington's problems, and we offer no quick fix today. Such quick solutions do not exist. It will take time for things to get better here. An entire community, an entire metropolitan area must be mobilized in constructive anger and purpose against drug crime, drug criminals, and those who aid or abet them. I am pleased that this administration is able to help, and I promise to revisit the situation in Washington in 6 months' time and at 6-month intervals. Report to you at that time on those occasions on progress made, problems still unresolved, and promises kept or unkept.
Part of Bennett's community mobilization program includes more federal money for drug education programs in Washington schools, expanded job training, and 3 new drug treatment centers. Joining us now to look at the reasoning behind today's announcement and its possible national repercussions are Walter Fauntroy, the Democratic congressional delegate from Washington, D.C., from Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates, and in the studios of public station WNED in Buffalo, New York, crime expert Bruce Jackson, director of the Center for Studies in American Culture at the State University of New York in Buffalo. Mr. Jackson is the author of Law and Disorder, Criminal Justice in America. Delegate Fauntroy, it's your city. What do you think of the plan?
Well, first of all, the new drug czar is carrying out the mandate that we in the Congress gave him last year in the Omnibus Anti-Drug Act. He is first coordinating and concentrating available federal resources together with local and regional resources to deal with the problem of drug trafficking. Secondly, he is assisting us in the District of Columbia, where the federal government controls 3/4 of the criminal justice system, by adding personnel that we need in the area of prosecutors and some additional help with our judges, although it does not go far enough in that regard. And third, he is importantly pointing up the need for eliminating drug trafficking within our public housing units through expedient eviction processes. And finally, we're pleased to see that he's coordinated and brought in the drug treatment and in-school training that we need in education for our young, so that it's headed in the right direction, although in many instances it falls short of what we actually require.
But you, as far as it goes, you applaud it, or do you have problems with it?
Well, I applaud the effort. For example, he adds 10 prosecutors to the U.S. Attorney's Office here, which is a federalized position. All cases are prosecuted by federal officials here. We need far more than 10. We have 27,000 cases to handle after our police force, which is locally controlled, has arrested 46,000 people in the last year and a half. Of the remaining 27,000, this 10 is going to handle 1,000 more. Obviously, we need more.
With all these people from different agencies working there together with the district police, is there not a danger of people bumping into each other and getting mightily in each other's way?
No, on the contrary, this is a national, regional, and international problem. And what he's going to learn here is how to fit together the international and national mix that's necessary for us to deal with a basic problem confronting the nation now that just happens to reflect itself most acutely right now in the experience of people who live in the neighborhoods of our nation's capital.
Let's go to Los Angeles. Police Chief Gates, you've got a lot of drug-related crime there and a great many shootings and murders. How does the plan look to you?
Well, I'm pleased that some action is being taken. I think it says that Secretary Bennett, unfortunately, has to move much more quickly than I suspect he would want to. But symbolically, we cannot allow our nation's capital to have names like the murder capital of the world. That just can't happen. And so I'm pleased to see particularly that he has 7 departments, 7 cabinet departments who have joined him in this effort. That says that the President of the United States, who really is the only man who can lead as Commander-in-Chief in any war on narcotics, is behind Secretary Bennett and is giving him the ability to put together this kind of a task force utilizing the resources of 7 cabinet departments.
Does that sound practical to you? Imagine it were your city to have all those federal departments suddenly descending on your efforts in the Los Angeles Police Department. Is it a practical thing?
Well, it's very difficult to coordinate. An example of our ability to coordinate, however, was the 1984 Olympics. We were able to bring together federal, state, local agencies, and in a massive coordinating effort, pulled off, I think, a very successful, very safe Olympics. So it is a job of coordinating. We in Los Angeles have asked for additional DEA agents, additional people from the FBI. We've asked particularly for additional prosecutors. Some of those we've received. We'd like to see more customs people, and of course we'd like to see more control of the borders, because we receive so much of the flow of cocaine coming through the border of Mexico.
May I say, as one who served on the Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control of the House of Representatives for many years, that this format is nothing new. It's something that we've come up with over the years, and the role of the czar was, in fact, to see if he could not be an instrument, a catalyst for coordinating the kind of intelligence, the kind of resource sharing that needs to be done between the federal government, between state and local governments, in a problem that is generally regional and not just local in nature.
Delegate Fontroy, does that mean that Czar Bennett, to use the title you've just given him, does that mean that he actually commands this effort now? I mean, is he going to be organizing drug busts and raids and coordinating the movements of various people, or is that still going to be the District of Columbia Police who do that?
That's going to be the District of Columbia Police job. We never envisioned the role of the czar as one of command, but one of building cooperation and coordination between all of the agencies and resources that need to be concentrated on this problem.
Bruce Jackson in Buffalo, how do you react to this plan?
Well, several parts of it trouble me a great deal. Historically, we've never been able to control drug abuse problems by law enforcement. We didn't control prohibition, alcohol abuse by law enforcement. We never stopped heroin or amphetamine use by law enforcement, and we're probably not going to stop cocaine abuse by law enforcement. That's not to say law enforcement isn't important, but the solution to this problem, I doubt very much, is going to come from increasing the number of people on the streets. Certainly Washington has a critical problem that has to be dealt with quickly. The trouble is this great mass of effort and resources going to do it? I suspect not. Second, there are a few communities that could be subject to the kind of federal assault Washington is about to get. I cannot imagine the mayor of New York welcoming this kind of invasion.
Let's come back to other cities and whether this is a practical model for other cities in a moment. I'd just like to go back to your observation. You don't think it's going to work to have more people on the ground. I mean, why not? If you arrest a lot more people and effectively get them off the streets, convict them, put them into prison, isn't that, I mean, isn't that generally considered a positive thing to do?
Well, I think a few moments ago I heard there was something like 30,000 drug-connected arrests in Washington in the last year. In the 1960s, this was tried. There were massive sweeps in New York City, and as I recall in Los Angeles, to try to pick off street-level users and dealers in an effort to interdict the market at that end of it. It simply didn't work. These are easily replaceable parts. What's happened in the cocaine and crack traffic is what we've seen is that people are arrested and arrested and arrested and the jails are filled, and it doesn't change the nature of the traffic. It just changes the nature of the law enforcement system, which then has to deal with this mass. The last I heard, the federal system was now about 50%.
Let me go back to Police Chief Gates on that one. Los Angeles was mentioned.
Well, I think that clearly we have to continue making the arrests. I would agree that more has to be done with those who are using narcotics. They are key to the problem. If there was not the demand that we have in the United States by these people, we wouldn't have a drug problem at all. Witness the fact that Castro said the drug problem would fade into obscurity if it were not for the tremendous demand in the United States. We really need drug education programs. Those are long-term. We have one in Los Angeles. It's all over the United States now. I think it's a scandal that we don't have that kind of a program in every elementary, every junior high school, every senior high school in the United States. We've been descended upon for now 30 years with this problem, and still we do not have in place in every school an intensive drug prevention program cutting down, educational program cutting down this demand. But the arrests of the users has to continue. They need to be jailed, and I think the best thing that's been working is taking things away from them, seizing their assets, whether it be an automobile, whatever they might have. I'm for taking those things away from those individuals. It's the only way you're going to start turning them around.
You don't think, judging by a piece you wrote in the New York Times the other day, Mr. Jackson, you don't think that works, taking things away from users?
Well, that is something else that was done, tried in the 1960s, and it had little effect. Also, remember, many of the people you're talking about as street users of crack are people who don't have anything to take away anyway. What are you going to take away from them? The people we're most interested, I presume, in getting at are the people who are making a great deal of money, the large dealers. Those are much harder to get at. But that's, if we're going to go after law enforcement, that's where we should go. I agree with Chief Gates completely that the way to go after this kind of problem is not by arresting people who already have a drug problem, but trying to get to it long before it becomes a matter of police.
I must say, in defense of the...
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Fauntleroy?
Yes.
Just to keep the discussion going here for a moment. Are the resources that this new plan puts into education and work on users anything like proportionate to the resources that are going into arrests and prisons and so on?
No, that is one of the shortfalls of this particular program. But let me say that the comprehensive program that we in the Congress fashioned and that the drug czar is attempting to implement on a pilot basis in the District of Columbia does call for more than law enforcement. It calls for in-school education and training. It calls for development of alternative economic options for young people who are engaged in the drug trafficking. So there's a STEP program, a summer training and education program that is a part of this package. Having said that, however, we do need to put much more into not only in-school education training and demand reduction in the largest drug-consuming nation in the world, but we've also got to involve law enforcement at another level. We're dealing with an international cartel that brings 150 tons of cocaine into this country. A $150 billion industry that involves a great many more people and that requires that we have international cooperation and that the President of the United States carry out an instruction that we've given him to develop an international and at least a regional strike force to deal with those larger problems. In the meantime, however, it is important that we beef up law enforcement at the local level at the same time that we increase our treatment and drug education and behavior modification and value modification efforts that have been referenced here by Mr. Jackson.
Let's discuss whether this could be applied to any other cities. This is going to cost, they say, $70 to $80 million. They say it's not new money. It's going to come out of existing programs, but that isn't specified. But suppose that were replicated in a number of other cities in the country. That would quickly mount up to a great deal of money. Is the Congress prepared to vote that kind of money to apply this kind of program to other cities, Mr. Fauntroy?
I fear not. The Congress does have a unique responsibility here. For example, as I indicate, we alone among Americans do not control our local prosecutors, our local judges, and we can't make decisions on our own with respect to our security facilities, our prisons. And the Congress, therefore, and the President and the federal government have a unique responsibility with respect to addressing the problem here.
But do you see the plan that's been outlined today in Washington applicable to other cities, Chief Gates?
Well, I indicated originally we'd love to see a little more help out here, but I think everyone has to recognize the federal government's broke. And if we continue to seek more and more funding from the federal government, we're going to continue the problem that we now exist in Washington, and that's a tremendous deficit. I think we have to turn to ourselves more and more and see if we can't find ways to produce solutions. Give me a few more jail spaces. I need those. I need them badly. Give me a few more prosecutors. I need those, and I need them badly. And I'll take whatever else the federal government can provide. But I don't think they ought to. We ought to continually ask them to expand and to go further and further in debt.
Well,
I think we do.
Does that mean the new drug czar position has no relevance to Los Angeles?
No, I think it does. I think that what Mr. Bennett's going to have to do, and I think he's going to do it, is really put together a very comprehensive approach to this whole problem. What we have in Los Angeles, what we've tried to stress, is a full spectrum approach where we go right to the interdiction of the supply of narcotics, the major dealers, the seizure of assets on a major scale, all the way down to the street peddler and the user, and also involve ourselves in a very comprehensive drug demand educational program. All of that has to be done. And we're going to have to look to the private sector to put more resources into this. And then we're going to have to start turning around some of the communities that are breeding grounds for the drug problems. Some of the communities such as Washington, I keep calling them third worlds. I see that Secretary Kemp is also calling them third worlds, and that's what we have in the United States. People are breeding narcotics and crime in those areas, and we need to find out why. And it just isn't money. It's getting involved.
Robin, can I say something?
Yeah, I want to go to Mr. Jackson just to ask his view on how applicable this kind of approach would be to other cities if this is a test program.
Well, law enforcement is the most expensive kind of drug control there is. I think it would be very inefficient in other cities. New York is strapped right now. Most of the major cities I've worked in recently are strapped right now. Everything we take to pour into this incredible consumer of resources takes it away from someplace else. The gains are flashier with drugs. You can have an article in the paper saying 150 arrests. It doesn't mean anything. The ones from the other kinds of modalities we've been talking about are slower and not as dramatic. I think they do far more good in the long run, and they're also much, much cheaper.
What is your comment on Chief Gates' characterization of these areas as third world areas?
I don't like it. There are cities. I spend a lot of time in Washington City. If it's third world, then I'm a third world person, and so are most of the people I know.
Yes, I would like to add, if you don't mind, on that question that that these are cities, they're urban centers, and of course it was Kerner who about 25 years ago pointed out that we were drifting into two nations, one poor and urban and the other rich and affluent in our suburban communities, and this is reflected in our failure to deal with those socio-economic problems that confront our urban centers. However, having said that, you ought to know that 60% of the drug consumption goes on in the suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C. Most of the trafficking goes on in the city, as most of the trafficking goes on in New York and in Los Angeles. But we have a regional problem. We have a problem of drug demand that is far beyond what some people would have you believe are third world communities.
All right, we have to leave it there, gentlemen. Delegate Fauntroy, Police Chief Gates, Mr. Jackson, thank you all for joining us.
finally tonight, yesterday's show of support for abortion rights. As we reported earlier, 300,000 or more men, women, and children converged on Washington yesterday. They staged a march aimed at urging the Supreme Court not to overturn its 1973 abortion rights decision. We want to examine whether such events really do have an effect on the court's thinking. But before we do, we offer some thoughts from essayist Ann Taylor Fleming on what the abortion debate is really all about.
Stop the killing now! Stop the killing now!
For a while, it seemed as if no one was taking them all that seriously. They were just a bunch of born-again fanatics going around bombing abortion clinics, or at least blockading them, putting their bodies on the line for God and fetus. In intentional evocation of the civil rights days, they have courted arrest and cameras by sitting down in front of clinics and refusing to move. They carried disturbing placards and tiny coffins, and bit by bit, they insinuated themselves into the public dialogue, until here we are, with the Supreme Court on the verge of reconsidering Roe versus Wade, the decision that 16 years ago guaranteed a woman the right to have an abortion if that was her choice. How did this happen? Can it happen? That's what a lot of people are wondering. Male and female, young and old, pro and con, Christian and Jewish. The right-to-lifers have undeniably held a mirror up to the country's conscience. People are debating the issue now, wondering aloud when life begins and when and whether it can be ended. Even people who once thought the matter was securely settled in their own hearts. Now, the pro-abortion side, or pro-choice as they prefer it, is fighting back. Hundreds of thousands of them staging their own mobile rebuttal in Washington this past weekend. There is a massive moral extravaganza being staged and counter-staged in the streets of America these days by people who can't even agree on the terms of the battle. Those opposed to abortion say it's about murder. Those in favor say it's about the right to make a private choice. And somewhere above the fray, in exalted legal land, sit the 9 supposedly dispassionate Supreme Court justices who will decide the outcome of this battle on their own terms. As for people in general, the hoopla on both sides has left them unswayed over the past 16 years. They remain predominantly pro-abortion. No, that's not quite right. They remain, in fact, convinced that abortion must be allowable, even as they believe it to be immoral. In their bones, they hate the idea of terminating a life, a pregnancy, call it what you will, and yet against that, they weigh the right of a woman to make that private choice to terminate and find that the higher good. In the most recent Los Angeles Times poll, for example, 61% said that they believed abortion to be morally wrong, but 74% said every woman had the right to make the decision about having that abortion for herself. What a balancing act. The right to privacy, that's the key phrase. Cold-hearted, selfish-sounding, hardly packing the moral wallop of right to life. Yet on some level, it apparently resonates more deeply in the national soul. Just ask Robert Bork. He said he didn't believe the Constitution guaranteed the right to privacy. Americans were alarmed, and Bork lost his chance to be on the Supreme Court. What the abortion battle comes down to is this: a door, a closed door, and what we have the right to do or not do behind it. More than anything else, more than the waving flag and the wheat fields and any other stirring visions of our native land, that closed door is our national symbol. True, we sometimes let the state get its foot in the door. We do it, though, with great trepidation, knowing that the legal system doesn't have much sympathy for our moral balancing acts, and that it will come down on one side or the other, just as the Supreme Court may do in the abortion issue. But no matter what the Supreme Court does, the balancing act by individuals between personal morality and private action will go on.
We turn now to the question of whether marches like the one yesterday have any real effect on what the Supreme Court decides. And 3 legal experts are here to help us weigh that. A.E. Dick Howard is a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. He was a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black in the 1960s. Gary McDowell is vice president of the National Legal Center for the Public Interest, a legal research institute based in Washington. And Eleanor Holmes Norton is a professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. She joins us from public television station WGBH in Boston. Thank you all, and may I say welcome. We've reconvened our three experts from the Bork hearings of not too long ago. Does the Supreme Court traditionally pay attention to public opinion? Let's start with you, Dick Howard.
I think the answer quite simply is no, it does not. The Supreme Court is really not like the two political branches. It's not like Congress. It's not like the presidency. I think the notion that somehow the justices are concerned about opinion polls and marches in the streets and other manifestations of public pressure on the court is simply misplaced. Now, this is not to say the court does not in some long-term sense respond to changes in society and its mores. Obviously, the justices are like the rest of us. They watch the evening news, they read the newspapers, they talk to their families, they move in society at large. And surely in some secular sense, the court will, from one age to another, adapt itself to the times and to the age. But that's a far different thing from saying that somehow they will be turned around in their course because people are picketing outside the Supreme Court's building.
Eleanor Norton, does the court pay attention when Americans express an opinion?
Well, no lawyer will tell you that courts pay attention to public opinion because they recognize that courts are institutionally those vehicles that express the meaning of the people's decision after it is written into law. Now, you heard a lot of people who are pro-choice speaking of wanting to influence the court yesterday, and most of those were lay people. I think the best way to understand the role of the court is to think of who it is that normally comes to the court. Who comes to courts, especially the Supreme Court, are most often people whose views differ from the majority. As somebody who was sitting in a segregated public school in 1954, I can tell you that if the Supreme Court had listened to the will of the people at that point, then my children might well still be sitting in that segregated public school. It was because the court could abstract itself and institutionally had to abstract itself in interpreting the Constitution from popular opinion that it was able to render a decision of the magnitude of Brown versus Board of Education. People who are on the outside, people who are minorities in any sense of the word, philosophical minorities, racial or religious minorities, are the last people who would want the court to listen to public opinion, because in that case the court would be no different from the Congress or the President.
Gary McDowell, what would you add to this?
Well, I agree with that, and I think it's unfortunate to have marches like that be perceived as being against the current Supreme Court.
Unfortunate?
Unfortunate. I think it denigrates the role of the court in American society to make it appear to be just another lobby where interest groups can go and have their views expressed and perhaps be persuasive. But I think the march yesterday has a deeper significance, and I think that is that it's really the opening volley in the next round battle over the next Supreme Court nominee. That I think their chances of swaying the current court is very remote, but their chance of letting the administration know what they're going to do if they should pick another Robert Bork or an Anthony Kennedy perhaps, I think it's very clear.
Eleanor Norton, you were participating in yesterday's march. What were the organizers really believing, hoping, expecting that they can affect what the court is going to do you think?
In a real sense, who started all of this demonstrating before the court were the so-called right to life people. They were the first people to march on the court, and Gary will remember, of course, that they spoke in exactly the same way that lay people yesterday spoke. No, I think that particularly the lawyers, and there were many lawyers around this march yesterday, the organizers recognize that what they've got to do is to prepare themselves for a political battle. No matter what the court does, you are going to see more and more legislation coming that attempts to cut back row, and that will in fact be tested in the court. Now, the way to stop that is to go back into the state legislatures. The people who are pro-choice have been, in essence, incumbents since 1973 when Roe versus Wade was passed. They didn't have to organize. They now recognize that they have to organize politically, and the chief importance, I agree with Gary on this, of yesterday's march was not its effect upon the court, which must at least act as if it didn't hear it. Its chief importance is to send a message to the state legislatures and to the Congress, and you will note that there were many, many public officials who in fact participated in order to show that they are hearing what the marchers were saying.
Gary McDowell, were the right to lifers who've organized previous demonstrations, as Eleanor just mentioned, is it their expectation that they can influence the court?
I think anytime anybody marches, they hope they can influence the court. And I think the Right to Lifers marching is as unfortunate a spectacle as it is for the pro-choice people marching. Because I do think that the court governs and is understood to govern by the moral force that it has by being independent. And anything that suggests a lack of independence is an unfortunate thing for constitutional government.
Dick Howard, should these people be out there expressing their views and saying, court, don't do what we don't want you to do?
Well, obviously they have an absolute right to be on the street saying the things they do, but I think they must be speaking to more than one audience. It seems to me that one of the purposes of a group like this putting on the demonstration that we saw yesterday was not only addressing a message to the court, to the presidency, to the state legislatures, but also a sense of reaffirmation of their own sense of common purpose. I think they'd like to think that they're not a beleaguered handful of people, but there are a lot of people who may not have been politically active, who may indeed have been coasting on the assumption that Roe v. Wade was carved in stone and could never be attacked. Now I think they feel, with 300,000 odd people having turned out yesterday, that there are a lot of people out there like them.
So they're bolstering each other to some extent.
Exactly, and I think it's quite right to say that one of the audiences that they ought to be worrying about are the state legislatures. Because if the court in the pending Missouri case decides to affirm what the Missouri legislature has done in whole or part, I think the signal will then be sent out.
This is the Webster case that's coming up later this month.
That's correct. The case that's being argued is from Missouri, a state whose legislature clearly has passed a set of regulations that are in some respects meant to be a test case. They're meant to see just how far the court will let the state legislatures go. Now, I don't predict, unlike some people, that the court is going to overturn Roe v. Wade in this pending case. I think the votes are not there for that. But if they affirm much of the Missouri statute, even if they leave Roe v. Wade standing, there are 50 states, all of whom are laboratories for test cases, and surely the wind will then be in the sails of further experimentation.
Well, what would the practical effect of that be?
Well, the practical...
Go ahead.
The practical effect of that would be that brush fires will be popping up on a lot of fronts, and there'll be a lot of litigation. The Webster case, however it comes out, the Missouri case, will simply be the opening salvo in what is bound to be a long line, a long campaign.
Eleanor Norton, how do you see this Webster case and these other cases that are coming down the line for the court?
Well, I agree that it is probably unlikely that the court will make a direct assault on Roe versus Wade, if only because courts are supposed to respect precedent, and especially the Supreme Court, which is supposed to respect its own precedents. That, of course, does not gainsay Roe because these cases that keep coming every year do give the court a basis to cut back Roe, chipping away little by little at it, so that you may wake up one morning and say, Roe still lives, but is it alive? Let me say one thing, Judy, about the use of the case or the court as a backdrop for a demonstration. While I think that it would be improper if people really tried to influence the court, I don't think that that's what demonstrating yesterday was all about. Remember, they marched between the Capitol and the Monument. They didn't march on the Supreme Court, and even if they had, it is a way to dramatize that very precious constitutional rights are at stake. And thus, I think it is perfectly proper, unlike Gary, to march in front of courts, because I think that in this country, symbolic speech has to do with making sure that your speech is understood for what you invest in it. And I don't think it necessarily means when you march in front of a court that you're trying to improperly influence judges.
Gary McDowell?
I think the real problem here is the people who are out there are more likely than not Dukakis supporters. They lost to a president who has stood foursquare against Roe.
You interviewed each and every one of them,
but
right?
One would guess. One would guess.
Yeah.
I think
were the ones outside of the court, because that's where a lot of right to lifers have participated. Were they likely Reagan supporters? Is that how this ought to divide out?
I don't know, Eleanor.
Well, before we go any further down that line, what does influence the court, the Supreme Court, and what will, and let's be very specific, what is going to influence these 9 justices when this case comes up later this month and in the coming months as they address it. Dick, you just alluded to it a minute ago. Gary, what do you think is going to influence the
I think the
justices?
power of the arguments they hear and the briefs they read and the arguments they hear during oral argument in a couple of weeks. I think they're going to be open for the kinds of things that will make them rethink the position. We don't know where Justice Kennedy comes down on this. We don't know the power of Justice Scalia to persuade on this. There are a lot of unknown factors. But I think it's going to be at the level of reason, not at the level of fluctuating public passion, that they're going to respond.
Dick Howard?
I predict that they will write an opinion or a set of opinions which will be very narrowly tailored to the facts of this case. The court is split down the middle. We have two justices who dissented in Roe v. Wade who have announced all along they're against that opinion. To that, I think you can probably add Justices Scalia and Kennedy. On the other side, you've got a camp of 4 who will stand by Roe, leaving O'Connor, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, in the middle.
In the middle. And
it seems to me that the court, more than most people realize, doesn't go into the conference room with broad philosophical outlines setting out to write an overarching kind of opinion for the ages. They tend to take the cases as they come, they look at the facts, they read the briefs, they hear the arguments, and they fall into a lawyer's mode of things.
You mean they're not sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, we've got the burden of the whole country bearing down on us and, you know, all eyes are upon us as we make this decision? You really think they can separate themselves from the emotions that are out there?
In a surprising way, they do. I think one would be surprised how quiet the court is. They're not detached from the world around them, but it seems to me that they've got roughly each term 150 different cases to decide. There are a lot of important cases there. They touch affirmative action, church and state, the whole range of questions. Surely the abortion case is one of the major cases this term, and it is freighted with more questions of moral and social values than most of the cases are. But even so, once they begin to work on it, I think it's finally a case which has to be decided.
Eleanor Norton, how do you see this case coming up, breaking down?
Well, Judy, I think this is a real test for how principled and how conservative this court is. The fact is that this court is not considering for the first time this question. It considered it in Roe versus Wade. The judges have well-known philosophical views here. The real question for this court is whether or not it's going to apply its own philosophical views or whether it's going to do what particularly conservative courts are supposed to do, and that is follow its own precedent. If Roe versus Wade were overturned or it were severely cut back, I think that this court would reveal itself to be an activist conservative court, and that all of the criticisms about activist liberalism would look quite hypocritical in that light.
Eleanor Norton, Dick Howard, and Mr. McDowell, Gary McDowell, we thank you all for being with us. You haven't lost your spark. Thank you. Robin?
Here again are the main stories this Monday. The Bush administration announced a sweeping federal effort to fight drug crime in Washington, D.C. And Oliver North said that President Reagan concealed an arms shipment to Iran. Good night, Judy.
Good night, Robin. That's our news hour for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the MacNeil-era NewsHour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Additional funding is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a catalyst for change, and this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Coming up next on Channel 2, when President Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, he believed it would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Examine Reagan's shield on war and peace in the nuclear age. Next.